It all began on August 23rd, 1993, when Nintendo announced a partnership with Silicon Graphics to create a successor to the Super Nintendo, with a 3D 64-bit console ready for release in late 1995 worth $250, codenamed Project Reality. This allowed Nintendo to skip a generation and jump straight into the 64-bit era. On June 23, 1994, at a private demo for journalists, Nintendo officially announced that the 64-bit successor would be named the Ultra 64. They also signed a deal with Midway to release 2 arcade games that were running on Ultra 64 hardware, which were Killer Instinct and Cruisin' USA, and were expected to be launch titles for the system, looking exactly the same as the arcade. Unfortunately, the arcade games were running on custom hardware, and the Ultra 64 wouldn't be as powerful as planned. It looks obvious after Cruisin' USA was released in 1997, and because of numerous delays, Killer Instinct was released on the Super Nintendo in 1995, and had to wait until the sequel came out that the 64 would get a Killer Instinct port. As a result of the delays, most games coming out on the Ultra 64 were being developed using SGI Onyx computers, even though they were more powerful than the console itself. For example, when Rareware began developing GoldenEye 007, they didn't even know what the Ultra 64 specs would be. So what they did was design the game based on what they thought the system specs would be, and change it all once the specs were announced. Finally, on November 24th, 1995, at the 7th annual Shishinkai Software Exhibition in Japan, Nintendo unveiled the first 64-bit video game console. No, the Atari Jaguar doesn't count. All they did was use 2 32-bit processors that add up to 64. That doesn't make it a 64-bit system. The name was changed from Ultra 64 to the Nintendo 64 because Konami held the rights to Ultra Gaming, and it was released in Japan on June 13, 1996, and North America on September 29th, although Europe and Australia had to wait until the 1st of March in 1997. Nintendo claimed the 64 was delayed so that the software would mature and third-party developers had time to develop games for it, although some believe it was due to hardware problems. For example, chips underperformed and constantly had to be redesigned. Super Mario 64 was also one of the reasons why the N64 was delayed, because Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to have 40 levels instead of 13. In fact, some things that couldn't be added into Super Mario 64 were added into The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, but those games have a story of their own. Here's the console at hand. Sorry guys, being that this is a channel called ColourShed, and yet I've got the worst colour. Now the 5th generation, I had a PlayStation instead of a Nintendo 64, but I did have relatives who had one of these with all the best games, like both Zeldas, Mario Kart, Mario 64, Mario Party, Donkey Kong 64, GoldenEye. So I got the best of both worlds in that regard. What was with the gimmick of naming all the games 64? It obviously worked, because today when we say a game with the number 64 at the end of it, we immediately think it was on this. But what will happen once a video game sequel reaches 64 at the end of the series? Then what? I loved this system as a kid, and I could have only dreamed of having both this and the PlayStation. I just got this recently, so dreams do come true. Now, to some degree, the layout is set up like the PlayStation. It has 2 action spots on the bottom left and right, the power on and off button, the reset button. You put your game in the middle, and you plug in your controller down here. No argument. Very simple, nothing to complain about. Now I hate the Mega Drive and Super NES power leads with its big boxes, because they always get in the way of other leads. But the AC adapter is connected to the console itself, so instead of trying to, plug it into a power end, that's a really good idea. I imagine this is where you attach the 64 disk drive, which is a waste because they never released it outside Japan. It has AV picture as you can see, but I haven't been able to get gameplay footage because I'm using an antenna cable, not an RCA cable, or otherwise I'd be reviewing one of these games right now. I could use my Super Nintendo RCA cable, but that broke in like a week because it's aftermarket. If you ever buy retro gaming related stuff, never go aftermarket. And here's another problem with the antenna cable. Nope, it doesn't fit. The problem is this box thing surrounding it. As you can see, it actually has very similar plugins, but because if it weren't for this box towering the console, it fit perfectly. I mean, what the hell were Nintendo thinking? I think the co-op multiplayer was one of the biggest strengths, partly because it had 2 more control ports than the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, but mostly because the gameplay was more fun. Before the days when online gaming was common, we had split-screen gaming. I mean, take games like Mario Kart, Mario Party, Super Smash Bros, GoldenEye, and Conker's Bad Fur Day for example. It was more than just 2 or 4 players battling against each other, it was an event. And most of the time, it was an amazing one. I can't say the same for the controller, however, because this was designed by someone who has 3 arms, 5 legs, and half a brain, because, well, you hold it like this, but the other handle... I mean, who thought having 3 handles was a good idea? The buttons that matter the most you use with these handles, and it certainly feels comfortable in your hands, but you should always have full access to all the buttons with your fingers. With this, you don't. What they should have done was taken away this handle here, have 2 Z buttons on these 2 handles, and move the analog stick over here, so it's a bit like, you know, the controller of today. While we're on the subject of the analog stick actually, that also leaves a lot to be desired actually, because, well, it's actually one of the first standard video game controllers to have an analog stick. And don't get me wrong, the feel and accuracy of this thing is really good, especially on GoldenEye with the sniper rifle. Feels like the Wii nunchuck attachment, but that's if it isn't worn out, because throughout the years, most controllers are now starting to have analog sticks that are wearing over time. Like, I just got this one recently, so I don't have that issue for now. But put that into consideration when you get an N64 controller. As you'd expect with almost every gaming console, there are accessories that made it better or worse. The rumble pack, which makes the controller vibrate, and the controller pack, which is basically a memory card for save files on particular games like Turok 2's Seeds of Evil. Now you can't have an N64 without the expansion pack here, which adds double the RAM size on the system and allows longer draw distance, bigger resolution, and higher texture quality. Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark, and The Legend of Zelda's Majora's Mask all required the expansion pack to play these games, but it was only optional on the rest. At least Rareware had the courtesy to bundle the expansion pack with DK64 because you needed to stop any crashing, glitches, or slowdowns. That was the problem with this game. If you didn't use the expansion pack, forget it. Now, like I mentioned before, there was an extension port to attach the 64DD under the system, which was a disk add-on for the console so you can connect to the internet and play games using 64MB floppy disks. It was announced at the Shishinkai Software exhibition, and a lot of the best games were planned to be released for the add-on. But throughout the years, those games were either made on standard cartridges, went to the GameCube, or cancelled altogether like the Super Mario 64 sequel. Until December 1999, it finally came out only in Japan, and the RareNet, the online service, only lasted a year and a half. Today, it's considered a commercial failure and a collector's item. Speaking of fails, there is one big problem with the Nintendo 64 that probably cost the company big time in the long run. This. No, not the game. Definitely not the game. I'm talking about how it was stored. Cartridges. For one thing, it has no end labels. I had to make my own ones. It's actually not a problem with the console, but more a problem from a business perspective. The reason Nintendo selected cartridges over CDs is because they were too slow to process what Silicon Graphics were looking for. Force 5 said, We use the cartridge almost like normal RAM and are streaming all level data, textures, animations, music, sound, and even program code while the game is running. With the final size of the levels and the amount of textures, the RAM of the N64 never would have been even remotely enough to fit any individual level. So the cartridge technology really saved the day. So basically, higher pixel quality and no loading times. But anyone who has the same brain as the controller designer would know the real reason why Nintendo stuck with cartridges. Because there's no actual disk drive inside, it would have been more reliable and reduced the cost of the N64 as it cost $400 less than the Saturn and $300 less than the PlayStation. And finally, cartridges would avoid piracy better than CDs. But Nintendo didn't look at the drawbacks. They held only 16 megabytes of data. Yeah, there were some 32 or 64 megabyte cartridges, but to give you an idea how tiny that is, a PlayStation CD can hold close to 700 megabytes. But that was only the beginning. PlayStation CDs cost less than $1 each to manufacture. Cartridges cost $10 to $15 each, so if a game didn't sell well, gaming companies could lose a lot of money, so most of the time, they didn't take the risk. It definitely shows on the price of games when they were new. And publishers had to buy them through Nintendo. Now back then, Nintendo's relationship with third-party developers was bad enough thanks to lock chips on their previous consoles, in which Sega actually used to their benefit with the Mega Drive. But thanks to continuing stubborn business decisions, lots of third-party developers had enough and went to Sony instead, who gave smaller production costs and more space to work with. Squaresoft were initially releasing Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64, but like most big-name third-party developers, they were increasing their scope and the sequel to 6 was looking to be huge. With a 16 megabyte cartridge, 64 at best? So, they went to Sony instead to release Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation in 1997 on not just 1, but 3 discs. Imagine how many cartridges Squaresoft would need to make one full copy of Final Fantasy VII on the N64. Imagine how much that would cost for the consumer. The game sold close to 10 million copies and helped popularize the Japanese role-playing genre around the world. Speaking of RPGs, there were hardly any on the N64, with Paper Mario being the only good one, and that was released in 2001, the same year as the Nintendo GameCube. After Squaresoft moved their gaming projects to the PlayStation, lots of other third-party developers followed suit. For example, Konami released over 50 games for the PlayStation, including Metal Gear Solid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, but released only 13 for the N64 and didn't have a highlight on the console. As a result, Nintendo had only a third as many games compared to the PlayStation and had to rely mostly on their first-party games like these. And obviously rarewares too. Think about the games that come out on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and find out whether they come out on the Wii U or not. It was practically the same thing with these two consoles. I'd also like to mention that if Nintendo did use discs, I think they could have been backwards compatible with future consoles like the Nintendo GameCube or Wii. Think about that. But, on the plus side, they had more exclusive games, and the percentage of high quality games in conjunction with the total number of games made for the system is higher than the PlayStation. But, back then, you could also look up game reviews to know whether a game is good or bad, so we can tell whether we should buy this game or that game, so it didn't really matter that much. After the Nintendo 64 was discontinued in 2003, Nintendo sold 32.93 million units worldwide. While it was a very successful console, in Nintendo's eyes, it failed because it was the first time they made a system that didn't sell more than their rival. Yes, they beat Sega because the Saturn only sold 9.5 million units, but let's just say that Sony got their revenge on Nintendo after the Super NES CD add-on fiasco, by selling 102.49 million PlayStations worldwide. In conclusion, it was the first time that Nintendo were no longer first place. Sony were pissed off by Nintendo's betrayal and wanted to show them up by beating them at their own game, and the number of units sold illustrates that. But when it's all said and done, this is a great video game console. It revolutionized action adventures, 3D platformers, first-person shooters on consoles. It began the Super Smash Bros. And Mario Party series. which probably makes it the best console for co-op multiplayer. The only thing that's possibly better for that kind of thing is another Nintendo console. Thanks, Nintendo. Reviews are my specialty, so don't forget to watch them, and if you want to be alerted on any future videos, don't forget to subscribe.